Looking at other stories through the lens of Final Fantasy can be a fun and interesting exercise. There are a lot of video games, not to mention shows, movies, and books, that feel like Final Fantasy, even if they are definitely their own thing. Plus, we are kind of the opinion around here that everything is Final Fantasy. My name is Drew Kreisman. I am one half of the Final Fantasy Weekly podcast, and these are my picks for the top 10 things that feel like Final Fantasy, but aren't. Number 10, Horizon. Let's start by really stretching it here. Horizon Zero Dawn and Forbidden West are in no tangible way related to Final Fantasy, and they're mostly just here because I love them dearly, but that's also partly because they remind me of my favorite franchise in a lot of ways. Perhaps the biggest is the combining of fantasy themes and old-world settings with science fiction themes and high technology. That web grows increasingly entangled around a fantastically developed main character who, in the sequel, finally meets a group of friends that sure feel like some light warriors to me. A sprawling adventure, a fantastic story, beautiful music, and a cavalcade of characters you care about in a unique world? A Horizon can be honorary Final Fantasy. Almost everything is.
Speak her name!
Aloy!
Number 9, Star Wars. Of course, this is backwards. Star Wars feels like Final Fantasy because Final Fantasy feels like Star Wars. The king of JRPGs has never been shy about drawing on the vast fiction of George Lucas and friends, going so far as to borrow characters Biggs and Wedge as a kind of running joke, and even quoting the Galactic Saga directly during important moments. There's also no shortage of the Rebels versus the Empire in these games. For some entries in the series, you could add Lord of the Rings or various anime to this part of the list, but Star Wars is the most influential of these on the franchise, making diving into either a similar experience.
Then, there's someone here I think you should meet. May the Force be with you.
Number 8, Studio Ghibli films. Founded in 1985 by Hayao Miyazaki, Toshio Suzuki, and Isao Takahata, Studio Ghibli is responsible for some of the most beautifully animated films to ever exist. Outside of Nausicaa planting the seeds for the Chocobo, I'm unsure if the creators of Ghibli were inspired by the creators of Final Fantasy or vice versa. It is clear, though, that many of their stories played with the same ideas. From environmentalism to spiritualism, frantic action juxtaposed with quiet moments, swashbuckling adventures, and lonely romantics, each cast of Ghibli and Ghibli-adjacent films could easily be incorporated into the Final Fantasy multiverse. And let's not forget about the time it actually happened, Ni no Kuni. Other than their own forays into film, a Studio Ghibli movie is the closest thing you can get to watching a Final Fantasy story on the silver screen. Number 7, Lost Odyssey, Blue Dragon, and Fantasian. I must start by admitting I have not played any of these, as I don't tend to game on the systems they are available for. That said, one needn't know much more than their pedigree to know that they fit as a part of the extended family. The visions of Hironobu Sakaguchi, the father of Final Fantasy you may know, Lost Odyssey, Blue Dragon, and most recently Fantasian are praised far and wide by fans and critics alike. Some even believe they hold the core themes of traditional Final Fantasy even better than some of the games in the actual franchise. Regardless of how you feel about any of that, it is difficult to deny that the spirit of Final Fantasy lives in these gems. Number 6, Triangle Strategy, Bravely Default, and Octopath Traveler. the modern throwbacks. Tomoya Asano leads production of Bravely Default, Octopath Traveler, and Triangle Strategy, all of which are modern games built specifically to mimic the style and feel of older JRPGs, Final Fantasy in particular. There are even shared item names, musical motifs, and plenty of heavy thematic influence. The battle systems in particular draw from the 2D era and harken back to the turn-based beauty of old, while still innovating in their own right. Perhaps the most clear link, though, is Bravely Default, which is a direct sequel to Final Fantasy, The Four Heroes of Light.
But first, I just need to hear it from you. Say that you'll stay till the very end. With that done, let's get you on your way.
Number 5, Xenogears, Mana, and Saga. Famously, though probably not that famously, Xenogears actually started as a Final Fantasy game, at least according to legend. It even has a Tifa poster in it. Also, Cloud makes mention of Xenogears during his delusions. Speaking of legend, the Saga series began life as Final Fantasy Legend before branching out on its own with classics like Romancing Saga and Saga Frontier. Similarly, the Mana series also benefited from such a boost from its cousin, starting out as Final Fantasy Adventure. Each of these games are quality on their own merits, but clearly owe a debt of gratitude to the series we celebrate here. And I'd be remiss if I didn't at least mention Air Guys and, you know what? The Bouncer. Number 4, Dungeons & Dragons. It could be said that every Final Fantasy game is actually just an elaborate D&D adventure. While just about every entry on this list has thematic and philosophical similarities to the series, Dungeons & Dragons gets extra points for also being essentially the backbone of the adventuring gameplay experience. The original Final Fantasy borrowed heavily from D&D, including monsters like the Illithid, Sahagin, and Merilith, deities like Bahamut and Tiamat, and even the choice of classes: fighter, thief, monk, cleric, mage, and bard. In everything from the way it looks and feels to the way it plays and functions, Final Fantasy owes a great deal to the original role-playing game. Number 3, Vagrant Story. Vagrant Story wasn't just written and directed by Yasumi Matsuno, the mastermind behind Final Fantasy's Tactics and 12, it actually takes place in the same country. It is an official part of the Ivalice Alliance, which also includes games like Final Fantasy XII Revenant Wings and the Tactics Advance titles. It very much tells its own story, has its own essence and feel, and certainly isn't overloaded with references or nods to main Final Fantasy numbered titles. But Vagrant Story is an essential member of the family nonetheless. Whether it always feels like one or not, there is no way of getting around that this underrated and oft-forgotten title is an epic tale set in a Final Fantasy world.
Oops, sorry.
Which way you're going, churl? What? My pouch! It's gone! The boy! Get out the way!
Number 2, the Chrono games. Chrono Trigger was the brainchild of the Dream Team. Like Final Fantasy, it was born out of a desire to mix together ideologies and make something new. The creators of Dragon Quest and Dragon Ball Z got together with the Final Fantasy folks and ended up making one of the greatest games of all time. Including characters like Biggs and Wedge, a few sound effects, most notably Kefka's mischievous laugh from Final Fantasy VI, and plenty of design elements. The Chrono games officially took their place in the multiverse when Trigger was released alongside the 4th entry in the series with Final Fantasy Chronicles for the PlayStation. Cross and Radical Dreamers may be more distant relatives, but these games share some DNA, and also the legacy as some of the best story-driven games ever made. Number 1, Kingdom Hearts. The clearest piece of crossover content, Kingdom Hearts could lazily be described as Final Fantasy meets Disney. And while that is a vast oversimplification of one of the most original and creative and convoluted franchises in video game history, the story of Sora, Donald, and Goofy isn't just littered with references and thematic ties, but also with literal characters from the Final Fantasy series. Leon, a reimagining of Squall Leonhart from Final Fantasy VIII, plays a pivotal role in the story of the first 2 games, leading an ever-growing list of cameo appearances. This includes, of course, Cloud and Sephiroth locked forever in their eternal dance, a trio of friends on the beach, and Setzer of Final Fantasy VI playing games with the locals. And that's barely scratching the surface. Kingdom Hearts is the perfect example of how something can be very Final Fantasy, but also entirely its own wonderful collection of concepts.
I've been having these weird thoughts lately. Like, is any of this for real? Or not?
Thank you for watching and listening. Thank you to Deadman Gaming for editing and Twinstrumental and Avernicus for the music. And of course, thank you to all of our Patreon supporters out there. What else feels like Final Fantasy but isn't? Let us know down in the comments. For more Final Fantasy content, head to patreon.com/ffweekly, and for all kinds of fun nerdy stuff, check out patreon.com/DCProductions.